Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to wait one more minute and see if anyone else is going to hop on, and then we'll get started. Okay, go ahead and get started. So again, welcome to today's webinar. The subject is R2V3. We're going to be providing a very high-level overview of the changes between R2V3 and R2 2013 for clients who are pursuing certification for the first time or who are preparing to transition from R2 2013 to R2V3. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Today's webinar will cover a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do, some of the benefits of certification to a standard like R2. We will highlight the transition timeline information for clients who will be transitioning, as I mentioned. We'll spend the bulk of our time on the revised standard, the R2V3 standard, some of those key changes. We will close the presentation with an overview of the certification process for anyone who might be pursuing certification for the first time. And we will also save time for questions at the end. You can type your questions into the question field at any point throughout the presentation, but I will save those for the end. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have clients certified to a variety of standards around the world. This is not an all-inclusive list of countries in which we have certified clients, but certainly gives an idea of our global presence. And we are accredited to grant certifications to a wide variety of standards. R2 2013 is one of those standards, and we are in the process of pursuing accreditation to R2V3 as well. We are currently conducting R2V3 audits and pursuing accreditation to be able to issue accredited certificates once that accreditation has been achieved. And I will keep the webinar slides updated as to the status of our accreditation. I offer these webinars every month or two. There are a variety of benefits of certification to a standard such as R2. It represents a commitment to responsible reuse and recycling of electronics and electronic components. Obviously, that is the backbone of the standard. So being able to advertise R2 or R2V3 certification represents that commitment, the responsible reuse ideally, and if not, responsible recycling of those electronics. Maintaining certification to a standard like R2 improves the organization's EHS performance, environmental health and safety performance by implementing and maintaining the requirements of the standard, which include a variety of EHS components. The certification also represents a framework for meeting customer or regulatory requirements, can drive improvement or increases in management commitment and employee engagement. Maintaining a certification like R2 can also provide a competitive advantage over competitors or other recyclers who don't maintain R2 certification or perhaps haven't transitioned to R2V3 yet, as well as improving public image in some instances. In addition to the competitive advantage or improvements to public image, besides those potential financial benefits, there could be other financial benefits depending on the area in which you operate. In some cases, maintaining certain certifications or standard management systems might result in insurance premium discounts, for example. Certification can also help achieve strategic objectives or stakeholder requirements. It also provides the ability to integrate the standard and the management system with other business management systems that are compatible and able to be integrated. For companies certified to R2 2013, CIRI has published their transition information through Advisory 22. So that is a code of practice advisory. You can find it on CIRI's website. The standard itself was published July of 2020. You can also download a copy of the standard and the supporting documents on CIRI's new website, which I also have listed here. You can also find a revised code of practices on the CIRI website. We don't have an R2 guidance document yet. So I will talk a little bit about the contents of Advisory 22, although it is available for download from CIRI's website. I do want to highlight that the audit in which you or your organization transitions to R2V3 from R2 2013 cannot be conducted virtually. It must be on site, at least the R2 time. The same goes for new clients pursuing certification for the first time to R2V3. The stage 2 R2 time will need to be conducted on site. Those are not permitted to be completed virtually. So the transition information, again, can be found in Advisory 22 from CIRI. It's a Code of Practice Advisory. There's a staggered approach to this transition in that the deadline for your organization to transition is dependent on the expiration of the certification that you currently hold, depending on whether your recert audit is coming up or not. And then there is an overall deadline for all certificates to transition by. So we'll get into more details on that in a minute. As I mentioned, we're pursuing accreditation to R2V3 as a registrar, or as a certification body. So all certification bodies will have to obtain accreditation to R2V3 before we can issue accredited certificates. So again, we're currently auditing to the standard. We have been trained to the requirements of the standard. We have incorporated those into our processes, but until we achieve accreditation, we can't issue those final accredited certificates. PJR issued their own transition plan, which you can find on PJR's website. It contains a high-level summary of Advisory 22, as well as PJR's own internal deadline by which we suggest our clients transition. This is how we guarantee no lapse in certification. So your audit needs to be scheduled early enough to allow for the certificate decision-making activities that occur after the audit concludes, before that certificate gets issued. If there's not enough time in between those activities, we could potentially see a lapse because the turnaround time can only be shortened so much. With a lot of clients transitioning at the same time or pushing that deadline a little bit, we may see resource strains and not be able to prevent a lapse if audits occur too close to that deadline. So take a look at the transition plan that PJR has issued if you haven't already. In most cases, we'll see our clients transition in 2022 if they haven't already transitioned. So the transition information in Advisory 22, again, is based on the expiration of the certifications. For facilities pursuing initial certification do have to be audited to R2V3 at this time. We are no longer able to audit to R2 2013 for new registrations. So I can see this verbiage is a little bit outdated, and I will update that before we publish these to the website, but we are clearly beyond the January 1st deadline. So we're currently only doing stage 1 and stage 2 registration audits to R2V3. Now, for facilities with existing R2 2013 certificates, again, the transition requirements depend on the expiration. If the certificate expires sometime this calendar year, then you are able to recertify to R2 2013 if you can meet all of the applicable requirements. And those are shown on this slide. The R2 2013 recert audit has to be completed before January 1st of 2022, so before expiration, which is required anyway. All NCRs, both minor and major, need to be closed and verified before certificate issuance, and the new R2 2013 certificate expires by June 30th of 2023. So this reflects the overall deadline for certificates to transition to R2V3. So if you are able to recertify one more time to R2 2013, you might not get as long, you won't get the full 3 years for your certificate because you do still need to transition by the overall R2V3 deadline. If your certification expires after December 31st of 2021, you can transition during your subsequent audits. You don't have to transition during a recert audit. You can transition during any audit in the cycle. However, I do want to note, you can see in the second to last bullet point, the transition audit time will be higher than a typical surveillance audit, actually higher than a typical recert as well. It's equivalent to a registration audit time. So the stage 1 and the stage 2 totaled together. So again, the transition audit cannot be virtual, and the time will be increased to that of a registration audit. The transition audit needs to cover all of the core requirements and all applicable process requirements. And this gets into the R2V3 changes. We'll talk about some of that terminology shortly. So keep those things in mind. If you haven't already discussed when you'll transition, maybe reach out to your scheduler and start that dialogue. It is going to take some prior planning on your part. The overall deadline for all R2 2013 certificates to have transitioned is June 30th of 2023. Any still existing R2 2013 certificates will be obsolete after that. They'll be withdrawn, and then you would need to start over with a new registration. I've put some of that information in a timeline. Sometimes a visual representation is helpful. So already we are no longer conducting R2 2013 registration audits, and you can determine when you want to transition based on your expiration date of your current certificate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today on why the standard was revised. Standards get revised for a lot of general reasons you can see in the bottom bullet point, making sure they continue to have market relevance, are compatible with other standards. They're flexible in that they can be applied to a variety of organizations within the industry. There's a lot of variances in this industry in size and the type of materials processed. But R2 2013 specifically was also revised to account for lessons learned by CIRI, the R2 Technical Advisory Committee or TAC feedback, public comments from a variety of sources, to reflect the diversity of the industry, and to reinforce effective implementation of standard requirements. CIRI really wanted to make sure that the intent of the standard is being achieved. So some of the language is strengthened when in areas where perhaps CIRI found certification bodies holding clients to the requirements a little bit differently. If there wasn't enough consistency or the intent wasn't consistently being met, that verbiage was adjusted to clarify those requirements, to remove ambiguity, things like that. I do want to mention a couple things about this training. This is a free webinar, so this does not represent training from CIRI. This does not represent lead auditor training criteria, anything of that sort. CIRI's website is a great resource for training on the new standard, training opportunities to the new standard. I know they're offering it to not only certification bodies at this time, but in some cases, they open it to consultants and internal auditors and different personnel who may find that helpful. Keep an eye out for that if you haven't seen that already. This is really a high-level overview to give our clients, as a courtesy, some areas to focus on, or just a starting point to get a sense of some of the main changes in the standard as they're preparing to transition and where they should focus some of their time, or perhaps look into more detail on CIRI's website in some areas. So I want to also emphasize that CIRI has made very clear, despite the way that this is reorganized a bit and the verbiage has changed, no significant changes have been made to the intent of the original standard. So reuse is still first and foremost the goal of R2 and CIRI. Obviously, responsible recycling in instances where the items cannot be reused. The standard, as you can see, I've included a screenshot of the table of contents, has been divided into two main sections: the core requirements, of which there are 10 instead of 13 provisions, and the process requirements, which are housed in the appendices, but they contain a lot of really important information and requirements. So those are an important part of the standard as well. The process requirements will be selected based on the R2 facility's scope of operations and their certification scope, the activities that they perform. So all core requirements, all 10 core requirements will apply to all R2V3 organizations. However, the process requirements will be selected based on the scope. Not all process requirements will apply to all R2V3 organizations. As you read through the standard, there's a greater emphasis on reuse. There is an increase in the amount of prescriptive requirements in certain areas, such as data security, testing, and repair. Again, maintaining that emphasis on reuse. Some requirements have been clarified, as I mentioned, if they were not understood or effectively implemented in the past. I mentioned there used to be 13 provisions, now there are 10 core requirements, and you can see based on the screenshot that there's some changes to the order, the grouping, things have been restructured a bit. The other key change I want to mention here before we get into the standard is the creation of the R2 equipment categorization document, or the REC. We'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail, but you'll see a lot of references to the REC throughout the standard, and that is something you want to use hand in hand. It is a reference, however, meeting the requirements of the REC is the only way to meet a variety of the requirements in the R2V3 standard. So using both is required. I'm going to briefly go through section by section. Some areas do not have significant changes. And again, this is not a full R2V3 course, so I'm going to move through this part pretty quickly. I want to be able to talk about the appendices and the REC a little bit as well, as they are so important to the R2V3 implementation. You can download a copy of the rec from CIRI's website, and as I mentioned, it's to be used in conjunction with the standard. You'll find that the rec provides an outline for the requirements for evaluating electronic equipment and components, as well as categorizing those equipment and components based on their condition. The categories in the rec can be utilized exactly as they are and incorporated into the R2 facilities processes, or if you don't want to adopt those specific categories, you can utilize a cross-reference. It needs to clearly demonstrate how the categories in the rec align with the categories being utilized by the R2 facility. There are no significant changes to the auditability of the documents. I mentioned we have a revised code of practices. R2 certificates will now also list the applicable process requirements. So now that we see those process requirements and the standard has been restructured a bit, you will see some changes to the certificates themselves as well. I'm not going to go through the terms and definitions, but I did put a slide in here to show you just how many new terms have been included in R2V3. There are quite a few. You'll want to become more familiar with these terms, more comfortable with them to make sure your facility and your management system are capturing all of the applicable requirements. R2 controlled streams, for example, to have an understanding of what that includes. Core requirement 1 focuses on scope. It's important to make sure that the R2 audits and the R2 certification include all of these bulleted items, and this is right out of the standard. It has to include all of the used electronic equipment, components, and materials managed, all processes and activities undertaken at the facility, all external processes, activities, and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification. For some organizations, there won't be any other locations, but it's in the requirements of the standard for those that do have other facilities that might fall under these requirements. All core requirements are to be included and any applicable process requirements. Services outside of the facility but still related to a facility's operations might include things like off-site collection, mobile data destruction, services performed at a customer's site. Those are just a couple examples. I mentioned that there are some changes to the way the certificates themselves will look as well once we are accredited and can issue those accredited certificates. You'll see the scope as you did before. You'll see allowances, if any, as you did before. You'll also now see all applicable process requirements and all legal names and legal entities associated with the certifiable activities operating at or in conjunction with the R2 facility. R2V3 requires R2 facilities to publicly communicate and maintain an ongoing list of all other locations that are not certified to R2, are owned and or operated by the R2 facility, and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. Certification to R2V3 cannot be granted to any organization that has been identified by CIRI within the last 2 years to have marketed their R2 certification deceptively or fraudulently, participated in illegal acts or activities, etc. So there are going to be some ramifications like this if CIRI has been made aware of these types of issues with a client pursuing certification, and that will prevent certification from being issued. No significant changes to the hierarchy. Again, the intent of the standard is unchanged. We see references in this section to core requirement 6, which talks about reuse in more detail, as well as to the rec. Core Requirement 3 houses the EHS requirements at a high level. It recognizes both ISO 45001 and OSAS 18001 in the interim until that transition period has closed for OSAS 18001, and then that standard will eclipse. Requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances, and then additional industrial hygiene monitoring requirements kick in for certain high-risk activities, and those are spelled out in Core Requirement 3, and there are references to the applicable appendix or process requirements found in the standard. This section also specifies the minimum accommodations for workers. Core Requirement 4 covers legal and other requirements. As R2 2013 did before, it requires the facility to document applicable legal and other requirements, including export, transit, and/or import for legality of international shipments. The language in this section has been clarified to make sure everyone understands this includes both shipments made by the R2V3 facility as well as by downstream vendors. So it's not a loophole if subsequent tiers are the ones to actually export the material. It's still applicable as it falls within the recycling chain. Core Requirement 4 requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations. It also requires that the facility notify their certification body if they receive a notice of violation that requires action or follow-up within 30 days. Core Requirement 4 prohibits child and forced labor. It also prohibits prison labor unless certain criteria are met, and it requires a non-discrimination policy with specified requirements and criteria within this section of the standard. Core Requirement 5 focuses on tracking throughput, requires summary reports be maintained for all transactions, both inbound and outbound. This section also specifies what those records need to contain. So they have to have things like accurate dates, detailed descriptions for all those inbound and outbound materials. There's also a requirement or a reminder in this section to make sure the total inventory levels are maintained below any limits applicable based on the facility's closure plan, legal requirements, things like that. So for example, if you have based your closure costs on a maximum amount of inventory storage, then certainly it would stand to reason that if you are storing more than that reported maximum amount, your closure costs may increase and your financial instrument may no longer be sufficient. So if you've identified a maximum or you have legal requirements that apply maximums, you need to make sure you have controls in place to not exceed those limitations. Core Requirement 5 also has limitations on how long R2 controlled streams or materials with a negative value can be stored. So the limit is 1 year with a couple exceptions noted. So you'll want to review these in more detail to understand whether those limitations apply to your specific organization based on the types of material you're receiving and processing, and then again, how you'll implement those controls to make sure you don't exceed those limitations. Core Requirement 6 focuses on sorting, categorization, and processing. This is where you'll find the bulk of the references to the rec. Core Requirement 6 requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing controlled and processed materials, and it has a lot of prescriptive requirements that need to be included in that documented process. So again, I mentioned earlier that all core requirements apply to all R2V3 facilities. So whereas the process requirements and appendices are picked and chosen based on the scope, all core requirements apply. Any requirement in the core requirement applies to everyone. So even if this is not typically your business model or part of your process, you're going to be required to have a documented process for meeting requirement 6 for the evaluation, sorting, and categorization. I just want to point out that distinction. It's a common question that we receive, and that is a key difference between R2 2013 and R2V3, or perhaps more accurately, something that's been clarified to make sure that the standard is implemented across the board unilaterally, or as close to the same as we can get, to make sure that facilities who might not deal with some of these types of materials as much still are meeting those core requirements that everyone is subject to. All materials are to be managed as R2 controlled streams. Again, you're going to want to get more familiar with that definition in the standard. So all materials have to be managed as R2 controlled streams unless it meets certain criteria. There is a level of recognition of these R2 categories and the REC categories if they're coming from another R2 certified or an R2V3 certified facility. I should clarify that we are referring to R2V3 here. Obviously, the R2 2013 requirements are different. All equipment or components are to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the REC. And data evaluations need to include any connected user accounts and services. Core Requirement 7 gets into the data requirements, and there can be some overlap between 6 and 7 here. Equipment or components not permitted to be reused, sold, or donated with written commercial agreements are still subject to the requirements of Core Requirement 7 and Appendix E, Materials Recovery. There are identification requirements found in Core Requirement 6 for equipment and components evaluated and found to be capable of reuse. Again, you're also going to see references to the applicable appendices in these various sections of the standard. Specific requirements for electronics or components categorized as an unrestricted stream, again, meeting those evaluation and categorization requirements of the REC, such as handling them separately from R2 controlled streams, being able to justify their classification, tracking records being maintained, including any reason for return. Those are just a couple examples. There's also requirements for transferring functioning products in Core Requirement 6, again, based on the demonstration of their functionality per the REC. Physical labels are not necessarily required. You can also use barcodes or other means of identification and tracking. There are no significant changes to the collectible and specialty electronics requirements. Core Requirement 7 covers data security. It requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with procedures to address subjects prescribed within the standard. You'll see the term sanitization used quite often, and in R2V3 it's used for both logical and physical sanitization, which means in the past where we perhaps drew a distinction or made a distinction between wiping and physical destruction, sanitization is being used for both in R2V3. In addition to the data sanitization plan, you also need a written data security policy. This policy needs to include the assignment of a competent data protection representative, and I have that capitalized since it's a defined term within the standard. I would encourage you to take a closer look at that one as well. The security program needs to consider risk of theft as well as unauthorized access. Core Requirement 7 also requires levels of security permissions for controlled access, again, based on the data protection representative's involvement and the types of equipment received, nature of data managed, things like that. There will be a lot of considerations here. It requires written acknowledgements be maintained for those granted security authorization, requires an incident response procedure for investigating potential or actual breaches, as well as a defined process to demonstrate 100% effectiveness of the destruction processes. Devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor if they've been verified according to Appendix A requirements. You'll see that within Appendix A, which talks about the downstream due diligence requirements, there's additional sanitization or destruction requirements or verifications if that option is being utilized. Core Requirement 7 also requires at least annual internal data security and sanitization audits to validate the data sanitization process, and this is to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. The organization needs to be able to provide information to suppliers upon request, including changes to downstream vendors responsible for processing their data-bearing components, as well as any security breaches. So that is upon request. Core Requirement 8 covers focus materials. Requirements to demonstrate the recycling chain's expertise, capacity, planned methods, and capabilities needed to process focus materials can be found in Core Requirement 8. This core requirement also requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart if you're not the final point of processing. And this circles back to Appendix A requirements. I do want to note some changes in R2V3. Alkaline batteries not containing mercury are not considered focus materials in R2V3. These would instead be managed under Core Requirement 2, along with print cartridges. However, R2V3 does consider even lead-free circuit boards to be focus materials. So there's no distinction here about the lead contents anymore. They're all focus materials. Core Requirement 9 includes facility requirements. Indoor processing is required, except in instances where outdoor operations have been assessed for risk and controlled. Indoor storage and labeling requirements for R2 controlled streams are detailed in Core Requirement 9, including indoor storage of all items for reuse, unless those items are intended for outdoor use. The section houses requirements for insurance coverage to be appropriate given the risk, size, and scope of operations. There are requirements surrounding the closure plan as far as the use of appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics under their control as well. R2V3 has a couple of exceptions for the requirement to hold a financial instrument. Again, all core requirements apply to all R2 facilities, R2V3 facilities, unless they meet exceptions spelled out within the standard. So in the case of the financial instrument, the exceptions would be all of the following. You have to meet all of the following requirements to not be required to have a financial instrument. If the total closure costs are less than $10,000 US, the size of all buildings owned, leased, or used by the R2 facility is less than 1,000 square meters, and the R2 facility never accepts equipment or materials containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. So unless you meet all three of those requirements, you will need a financial instrument for your closure costs to protect in the event of abandonment. Core requirement 10 focuses on transport. Again, this is the last of the 10 core requirements. There are packaging requirements as related to core requirement 7 if they are containing data and in compliance with core requirement 4 as applicable. If transporting data containing equipment or components, there are additional requirements as far as security, tracking, packaging. Core requirement 10 also requires the accuracy of codes, descriptions, declarations, labels, shipping documents, all of the above. So those are the 10 core requirements to which everyone is subject. And then there are the process requirements found in the appendices, which apply based on your scope. I'm going to go through these as well. These are where a lot of additional important information is housed. So Appendix A covers downstream recycling chain requirements, for example. This is where you'll find the specifics for the due diligence requirements, for the additional verifications required if, again, the downstream vendor will be responsible for data sanitization, for example. So Appendix A outlines the focus material plan and due diligence requirements, verification of import and export legality. It requires to have demonstrated the downstream recycling chain's ability to meet requirements found in the appendix. R2V3 does allow organizations to register their downstream recycling chain with SERI in lieu of some of the tracking requirements. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And communication between the recycling chain and suppliers is required. In R2V3, the use of an R2V3 certified downstream vendor allows an organization to streamline their due diligence process. All you need to do is verify the R2 certificate is the R2V3, certificate is valid, that the scope of certification aligns with the materials you're looking to send them, the types of processing you're expecting them to complete on those materials, things like that. And that the applicable process requirements have been included. Again, that would be on the certificate itself. So whereas in R2 2013, there was still some additional requirements implemented for the use of an R2 downstream vendor, R2V3 has streamlined that a bit more. For non-R2 downstream vendors, there aren't significant changes to the due diligence requirements. You're going to look at the core requirements and the process requirements in the revised standard, as well as the REC in some cases. Again, there's additional requirements for due diligence for data sanitization if that's being performed on the organization's behalf. That's also found in Appendix A. It's just really important to note that the R2 2013 downstream vendors don't count for this. So you're either treating them as an R2V3 downstream vendor or a non-R2 downstream vendor. If they are still R2 2013, unfortunately, you need to do the full due diligence on them. Certainly their R2 2013 certificate might help meet some of the requirements here, but they would not be considered R2 certified for the purposes of Appendix A. In some instances, SERI has pushed the idea or recommended that organizations transition as soon as possible so that when entities utilizing them in their recycling chain go to do their due diligence, they count as an R2V3 certified downstream vendor that much sooner. So if Siri has expressed that recommendation to you, that's part of their thought process there. Appendix B covers data sanitization. There's additional requirements to supplement core requirement 7. So additional requirements, additional explanations of the requirements. There is a greater level of prescriptive detail here as to what Siri expects to see. So when you are putting sanitization in your R2V3 scope, Appendix B is something that you are subject to and have to meet the applicable requirements of. Appendix C covers test and repair. So again, if you are completing those activities as part of your certified scope, you'll be audited to Appendix C as well. If you are applying Appendix C, if you are doing test and repair, you need a quality management system certification as well in R2V3. So this would be either ISO 9001 or RIOS. If you don't already have one of those quality certifications, you'll be required to add it in conjunction with or prior to transitioning to R2V3. You won't be granted an R2V3 certificate with a test and repair portion in your scope without that quality management system certification. This section also requires a written R2 reuse plan with prescribed criteria for inclusion, a requirement to process materials within 1 year of receipt, and maintain test result records for all functions with unique identifiers or for each uniquely identified item. So you need to be able to show the test results for each item. Appendix D houses the specialty electronics requirements. If you are pursuing Appendix D or the process requirement for specialty electronics, R2V3 also requires you to get Appendix C, which also means you'll need a quality management system certification. This section details criteria and verifications required in lieu of that testing. So if you are lacking the technical capability for the specialty electronics testing, you'll find details in Appendix D as to what types of verifications and identifications you need. Appendix B data sanitization requirements apply as well if those specialty electronics could potentially store data. There are requirements for specialty electronics which fail verifications, and there are also requirements for specialty electronics which pass the verifications. Verified specialty electronics for reuse can be stored indefinitely as long as they continue to have a positive resale value and a reuse market. I guess I should say and or, I'm not sure if it's one or the other. Sale of verified specialty electronics is limited to a customer's request for a specific part number or unique identifier, and this needs to be corroborated with a sales receipt or records of sale or other documentation. The R2V3 facility also needs to be able to demonstrate that the customer accepts the terms in Appendix D 4C, lack of testing, and will only sell directly to an end user, providing evidence of such upon request and with a free return policy. Appendix E deals with materials recovery requirements, and this is where we see the additional EHS, industrial hygiene type requirements for those facilities performing materials recovery related activities. Appendix F focuses on brokering. This applies to the sourcing and control of electronic components or materials delivered directly to a downstream vendor, even if they're delivered directly to a downstream vendor, and requires all R2 requirements be met by the R2 controlled stream, if not being met by the broker themselves. Downstream vendors are to be included and managed per Appendix A. R2 facilities pursuing process requirement F or brokering also need a quality management system certification, such as ISO 9001 or RIOS. The brokering R2 facility is responsible for core requirement 4, utilizing the REC, core requirement 10. There's specific requirements for brokers. So if this applies to your facility or you think it might, you want to take a closer look at Appendix F as well. I do just want to note that the only exceptions to the statement I made earlier about all core requirements applying to all R2 facilities would be brokers who never take physical possession of the R2 controlled stream. So if they never come through their facility or they don't have a physical facility in which to take control of those items, physical possession, not control. If those materials never pass through the broker's facility, then the broker does not have to demonstrate requirements of core requirement 3 or 9. They're not required to demonstrate the EHS pieces of core requirement 3. They're not required to demonstrate the insurance and closure cost financial instrument for core requirement 9. Those are satisfied by Appendix F if they do not take physical possession of those streams. And that's something that would be verified during your audit every year to make sure that continues to be the case. The REC itself, again available on Series website along with the standard, is the framework for evaluating electronic equipment, components, and materials, as well as categorizing their R2 status. And that's throughout each step of the R2V3 process. There are categories for cosmetic condition, functional condition, data sanitization status. I have a screenshot here on this slide of the table of contents of the REC as well to give you an idea of how it's structured. I mentioned this earlier, but the assigned statuses, if they match the REC requirements, can be accepted by other R2V3 facilities as well. So that should help streamline things as more organizations transition to R2V3. Again, you can have a cross-reference or utilize those exact REC categories. The latter would be the preference, to be using those exact categories. Not all categories in the REC will apply to all R2 facilities. You only need to use the categories that are relevant to your facility, the types of materials and equipment you are processing. Categories do not replace descriptions required for contracts, regulatory compliance, shipping documents, things like that. There are R2 processing categories applicable to all equipments, components, material streams. Material come in received as an unknown state until further evaluated and processed. And those are to be controlled per R2 standard requirements until the facility has confirmed they are not an R2 controlled stream. Again, you're going to want to look more closely at the definitions in R2V3. So Table 1 demonstrates the overall applicability of the standard and the REC. Items will be either R2 controlled streams, unrestricted streams, and you can get an idea of the subsequent processing requirements based on how those materials are categorized. There is a table in the REC for data sanitization status. After equipment has been sanitized, tested, and its functionality confirmed, it moves to the functioning product category in Table 4. This can get pretty confusing. Again, this is just a high-level summary in this webinar to introduce at least some of the terminology you'll find in the standard. The categorization of these items is going to be something that you as a facility need to review in more detail, as well as utilize any training platforms that CRE might be offering to get more familiar with the terminology and the requirements as you look to transition. There are functioning product categories, cosmetic categories, functionality descriptions. There's some appendices to the rec to provide additional detail and linkages between the categories. I mentioned that the Code of Practices has been revised for R2V3. There are several significant requirements in the Code of Practices, including the need to conduct contract or readiness reviews prior to a stage 1. We're calling these contract validations at PJR. There are changes to the certification structure for multiple facilities or locations, as well as the removal of the ability to sample multi-sites. So all facilities and locations need to be audited every year now. It does allow for one surveillance audit per 3-year cycle to be conducted virtually with R2V3. It requires correction evidence be verified by the certification body for both minor and major NCRs within 30 days. It also requires virtual off-site or on-site revisits to verify effective implementation of corrective actions for both minor and majors. So you will now have some type of revisit for any type of minor or major NCR for R2V3. R2 allowances have been removed and you won't see these on R2V3 certifications. However, they've left the ability to add those in the future as a placeholder should that change. I want to quickly take 2 minutes to overview the registration process for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time before we check any questions there might be. So if you're pursuing certification for the first time, you're not transitioning from R2 2013, but you're looking to get certified to R2V3, one of the first things you need to do is download the standard and the rec from CRE's website. You'll need to establish your management system documentation to meet all applicable requirements of the standard, conduct training, implement the requirements in the standard, including an internal audit, conduct a compliance evaluation, and perform a management review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as Perry Johnson Registrars to conduct your audits. You'll also need to submit any pre-qualification information required. As I mentioned, you're now required to have a contract validation audit before your stage 1 can proceed. So any information that's requested or evidence requested before your stage 1 is likely related to that requirement. You'll then complete both a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit, which I'll talk about more in a second. Address any resulting nonconformities, if there were any, before a certificate could be issued. The certification process is made up of 2 audits, a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit. Stage 1 audit evaluates the readiness for the organization to move on to stage 2 to ensure that they're ready for a stage 2 audit, which again requires on-site time. So before we have a lengthy audit, we want to make sure that the framework is in place and that the facility is ready for that audit. The stage 2 audit is an audit of the entire management system. Any nonconformities identified will need to be resolved prior to certificate issuance. The stage 2 covers all processes, all shifts. It's a full system audit. Subsequent to certificate issuance, you are part of a 3-year certification cycle or surveillance cycle. The certificate is good for 3 years. So for those next 2 years, You'll have surveillance audits. Those can be annual or semi-annual based on your contract. Those are partial system audits. They'll be shorter. They will not necessarily cover all the processes and shifts. The recertification audit on the third year of the cycle, however, will once again be a full system audit, very similar to a stage 2, and will result in the issuance of another certificate, good for 3 years, after any nonconformities are again resolved. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and type your questions in. I want to have our contact information up on the screen in the meantime. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Stacy DeSantis is our EHS Program Manager. We can both be contacted by email or by calling the main PJR line. They can put you through to our extensions. Siri can, of course, be contacted as well for any standard interpretation questions, R2V3 training questions, but we're able to support our clients at PJR with questions that they might have to the extent that we're allowed to answer. Certainly we support our audits during their audits as well. So you may contact us with questions you may have, and you can also reach out to Siri. I've also included the number for our sales department if you are a new client or a prospective client looking for a quote and some information about conducting audits with PJR. So we have a question about the presentation being available. I apologize, I forgot to mention that earlier. Yes, a recording of today's webinar as well as a copy of the slides will be made available on PJR's website in the next couple of days. You can check PJR's website for that. You can reach out to me if that is not available in the next 2 or 3 days. The recording of the webinar will be posted to our YouTube page as well to be viewed, again, at your convenience if there's something that you'd like to reference. I don't see any other questions, but I will hang out for a minute or two in case anyone is typing. If you have no further questions, thank you for joining us. I hope if your transition audit is coming up, I wish you luck during your audit. Certainly reach out to us if you do have any questions. Tune back in for future webinars. I'll keep these updated as to our accreditation status. Feel free to go back and reference the webinar information in the future for continued training. I don't see any other questions, so thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a great afternoon.